Jim, welcome to everyone. It's been fun looking at people sign in. We have a huge range from New York to Houston to Vermont to Kentucky to Tennessee. Plus, I know many people from this Pacific Northwest, so it's a pleasure to be here. Once again, my name is David Williams, and I will sort of be the quote-unquote moderator for tonight's event. It's pretty simple. We have two wonderful authors who will be talking to us. Robin Oliveira and Kirby Larson, and they will each talk for about 10 minutes or 10 or 12 minutes, just sort of giving us a little bit about themselves and how they work maybe. And then they will be in conversation together, which I thought would just be fun to hear whatever happens with them and wherever it goes. I think it'll be exciting because they're both excellent practitioners, both as writers and researchers. So I think they will bring a very interesting perspective. And we did not flip a coin, we went alphabetical. And so Kirby is going to start. So I will give the classic introduction, if I may. Kirby Larson is the acclaimed author of the 2007 Newbery Honor book, Hattie Big Sky, and the Dogs of World War II series, among other titles. Her distinctions include Bank Street College Books, American Booksellers Association Best Books, ALA Notables, New York Public Library Best Book, Junior Library Guild Selections, and an Edgar Award nomination for Audacity Jones Steals the Show. Such a wonderful title. A collaboration with her good friend Mary Nethery, has produced two award-winning nonfiction books, Two Bobbies, A True Story of Hurricane Katrina, Friendship and Survival, and Nubs, The True Story of a Mutt, a Marine, and a Miracle. Kirby tells us that she and her husband live in Kenmore with a very naughty dog named Raleigh. I also found out looking up that she has what I assume could be a unique claim for any speaker we have had with the Guild. She was born here in Seattle at Fort Lawton Army Hospital, and apparently was quite a good deal. She cost her parents $5. So I please welcome Kirby.
Thank you, David. That was sweet of you to look that up. That was funny. Yes, I am Kirby Larson, and I have a wonderful brand new revised website. It's kirbylarson.com. And so I would encourage you all to go check it out. The artwork is by a local illustrator, Carrie Lee, excuse me, she changed her name. And anyway, and there you can read more about my other books. So the question we are exploring tonight is what it takes to take historical facts and turn them into fiction. And so I sure am looking forward to finding out the answer to that question in my conversation with Robin. I feel a little bit like a fraud here because I really hated history when I was a kid. And I think that's because most of the way I was taught is to memorize dates of things and names of people, and those were not my strengths. And if only one of my teachers had told me that studying history meant that you got to be nosy and read other people's letters and other people's journals and diaries, look at old photographs, I might have bitten much more quickly than I did. I was an adult before I really discovered that I had a passion for historical fiction. And all comes down to, I'm grateful to a woman who never graduated beyond 4th grade. My step-great-grandmother, Hattie Inez Brooks. And when I heard she was like 4'11" tall, probably weighed 85 pounds. And she was alive until I was 10 years old. I was very fond of her, but I could never, when you're a kid, you never think of someone being an old person like that, being young ever. I forgot to set my timer. I'm going to do that right now. And so when I heard a snippet of a story that she had homesteaded all by herself in eastern Montana as essentially a teenager during the First World War, I did find it hard to believe. But that was so, I was so curious about that, like how she could have done it, if she really did it, that I kept researching. And I'm so lucky that we live in a country that has amazing records, because I was able to send away to the National Archives, and I learned, just as a little show and tell, I was able to get a copy of her deed claim. And that that tiny little lady built a clam shack, planted 40 acres of crops, set hundreds and hundreds of rods of fence, and lived in this, no offense if you're from Eastern Montana, godforsaken area, having to carry water from a creek. And she stayed there 3 years and she successfully proved up. And hearing that story made me want to learn more. And that launched me into writing that first novel, my very first historical novel, which was Hattie Big Sky. I'm going to talk to you just a little bit in a second about the kinds of research I do when I'm working. But I first want to say that most of my books are at least initially written for a younger audience. And I feel a huge responsibility for those young readers. I do not want to lead them astray. And so I work very hard to make sure my research is as accurate as possible. That's not to say I don't make mistakes. I have. I hope Robin will confess that she has every once in a while too. But I don't want some young reader to step away from a book of mine and think, I had made a mistake, and they believe that was something that really happened. Because I write historical fiction, I do create fictional characters, and I have received letters from young readers ask me what happened to such and such character, thinking it was a real person. Like, did they go to college? Did they marry their sweetheart? And I always feel so terrible breaking the news that, I just made those people up. But that also feels to me like an honor that my characters seem so real that kids want to know what happened to them after the books have ended. And I say kids, but I tell you, I get just as many fan letters for my books from adult readers. It was so fun with Hattie Big Sky because almost every adult would feel they would have to qualify. Like, okay, I'm 65 years old, but I love this book because of this connection. And so I never apologize for reading a kid's book because I think they're a very rich genre of literature. And it gives you something to talk about with the kids in your lives as well. And I think if a kid, if you write a story that a kid can't enjoy, it probably is a story that no one will enjoy. So I hope you'll give kids literature a chance if you haven't read any since Nancy Drew or those days. So I did mention that I work really hard, and I can tell from reading Robin's book that she works equally hard doing her research. And the reason I do so much research also is that I really want to feel confident of the stage that I'm moving my character around in. And so my research will often include things like scouting out a 1920s Collier Atlas so that when my character Hattie moved to San Francisco, I could move her around the city confidently. I knew where, I also use city directory, so I'd figure out which hotel she might stay at, and then figure out her path to work. And that just helps me have a visual of the world that she's living in. For the Dogs of World War II books, I even bought some World War II cookbooks that featured recipes that you could cook with the rationing coupons. And I would make some of those recipes to see what my characters might have eaten. But I did draw the line at making liver curry. That just sounded too disgusting to try. I love interviewing people connected with the events and the people I'm writing about. And I have found people to be so amazingly generous. One of the books I have written is called Dash, and I made a connection. I hope you could see this little photo. This is Mitzi Shiraishi, and she's holding her beloved dog, Chubby, in her arms there. And Mitzi was a strawberry farmer in Bellevue and one of the 120,000 people who were forcibly removed from their homes to move to incarceration camps during World War II. And I, through a series of connections, was able to meet with her family, who provided me with this amazing photograph. And I know you can't see it very well, but it's Mitzi's high school basketball team, and the girls are all wearing pearl necklaces. And even though they have shorts on, they're wearing thick wool tights under, or I guess they would have called them stockings under their shorts, so they could be respectable and presentable. And so you can see why I love photographs, to give me an insight into a time period. Sometimes I don't even have to go searching for the research I want. Sometimes it literally falls in my lap. That happened with me with my mother-in-law when I was working on Hattie Big Sky, which is set in World War I. I was sort of talking aloud about that time period, and she kind of disappeared into a closet, and she came out with a paper lunch sack full of the letters that her then 17-year-old father had written home to the family on the farm when he was stationed in France in World War II. And again, I know you probably can't see this very well, but it might give you the gist of it. There's a glare off this. I'll slip it out. So you see how there's a big white space here in the middle of this letter? That's not a faulty copying job. That's where the censors cut out a huge chunk of the letter that his name was Mike, and that Mike sent home. And I had heard of censored letters before, but I have to say, I thought it would be like, maybe a black line, or maybe a thickly crossed out sentence or two. I never imagined they would take a scissor to almost an entire letter. So it's really useful for me to see these primary documents so I can really see what the people who are living in the time periods that I am writing about were seeing. Sometimes, of course, I'm able to travel, and able to travel to a place to research. And that happened to me with Hattie Big Sky as well. I wrote that book starting in about 2006. And so many of the materials that are now digitized and easy to access were not available digitally then. So I bought a 99 Amtrak ticket to Wolf Point, Montana. And I spent 3 days in the newspaper morgues there of the Wolf Point Herald, a very smoky newspaper morgue. I guess they hadn't heard of how bad smoking is for your health. And I read every single issue of the 1918 and 1919 newspaper. And that's where I discovered these two interesting articles. In that time period, like all the events in a small town would be publicized. And one of the big concerns of the time was that certain men were not registering for the draft, and they were called slackers. And so in this headline right here, it says that a certain resident of the town named Elmer Wren had been arrested on May 2nd, 1918 for failing to register for the draft. And I read further in the newspaper, and on that same day, there was a headline that said, casualty list of an unlucky week. And in the very second paragraph, I found this line that said, a young son of Elmer Wren fell from a horse and broke a bone in his left arm. And I'm sure Robin will talk about this too. So this is what you do when you write historical fiction. I found 2 events involving the Elmer Wren family happening on the exact same day. And so I used my writer's imagination to try to figure out what the connection between those 2 events might have been. And so if you want to read the book, you'll find out how I resolved that situation. I thought I might close my time. Oh no, I do not have time, but I thought I would just close with one last comment that sometimes I use diaries to guide me in my research. And one diary entry I came across said, one winter, my mother and I were alone. Our little bunch of cattle came running over the hill to the corrals and barn as fast as they could. A gray wolf was chasing them and sprang at a yearling and bit his tail off. He stood there eating it. Mabel Cockle. And pardon the pun, but I found that incident so delicious. I had to find a way to work it into Hattie Big Sky. And so if you read, there is an incident where Hattie has to save her cantankerous cow, Violet, from a very hungry wolf. And I think I will stop there so we can hear from Robin, and then oh gosh, scare myself. And so she and I can have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirby. That was wonderful. And yeah, just so great to get that insight into what you're doing and to draw in. And as you said, you hated history. I think you're probably not alone in that. And hopefully what both of you do helps people get over that fear. So without further ado, Robin Oliveira is the New York Times bestselling author of 3 novels, Winter Sisters, I Have Always Loved You, and My Name is Mary Suter. She is a former registered nurse specializing in critical care and bone marrow transplant, holds a BA in Russian, and received an MFA in writing from Vermont College of Fine Arts. Recognition includes the 2007 James Jones First Novel Fellowship, the May 2010 Indie Next List, the 2011 Michael Sha'ara Prize for Civil War Fiction, and Historical Novel Society Editor's Choice, a Good Housekeeping Top 10 Read, USA Today bestseller, ABA IndieBound bestseller, Oprah Magazine Editor's Pick, several All-City Reads, 2015 Iowa All-State Read, People Magazine's Best New Books, USA Today Top 5 Reads, and most importantly, finalist for the 2019 Washington State Book Award, is what here. Her books have been translated into several languages. She currently lives outside of Seattle with her husband, Andrew, and I do not know how much she cost when she was born.
I don't know either. Kirby, that was really great to hear everything you had to say. And also, I really loved your visual aids because, as you know, historical fiction writers love that kind of thing. First, I want to preface my comments, but with two things. I had a bad bout of COVID in December, so I might cough. I have water, don't worry. And secondly, I'm a rather intuitive writer, and for me to codify exactly what I do is difficult, but I'll try to be as helpful as I can. I will probably be more illustrative than I am didactic. Now, as David said, I've written 3 books, and a 4th is coming out next spring from Putnam, all of them historical fiction. The first, My Name is Mary Suter, about nursing and medicine in the Civil War. The second, I Always Loved You, about the Paris Impressionists. And the third, Winter Sisters, about child abuse in the 19th century. And I'm going to provide examples from all my books to speak to the topic of turning research into fiction. So authors take different approaches to historical fiction. Some follow history closer, others lean away in what I like to call a more musical approach. Personally, I like to stick to history as much as possible. Many readers tell me that they like to learn history through fiction. It's easier. I do too. And as a governing principle in my own work, I won't violate what is known. My goal is to incorporate history as creatively and seamlessly as possible into a novel so that history becomes the character's lived experience and not a 3x5 paragraph of cool stuff that I've discovered that I want to tell readers about. So when I decide to write a book, when I discover through reading, curiosity, travel, whatever, some obscure piece of history that feels forgotten, and bonus if it illuminates our present. In My Name is Mary Suter, it was that 17 women became physicians out of their experiences in the Civil War, either nursing or volunteering. In I Always Loved You, it was that Mary Cassatt burned all her letters to Edgar Degas and his to her after his death. And for Winter Sisters, I discovered that in most of the states of the Union up until 1886 and sometimes later, the age of consent was 10. Now, since my principal job as a writer of fiction is to imagine, I try to imagine a story into all these forgotten morsels of history. And from that moment of first discovery, I begin my research. I often don't know anything about the subject I'm about to write about. So I usually begin by reading nonfiction about the subject just to get a broader understanding of things. And then I turn to primary documentation, historical maps, newspapers, diaries, court transcripts, railroad and ship timetables, old city directories, like Kirby mentioned, advertisements, photographs, contemporary travel guides, letters. I speak to experts in their fields, and this gives me the information I need to set my characters adrift in the actual limitations and operating world of the time in which they lived, so that they have to labor under the same constraints as a person living in that era. Those constraints underpin the story and inform it in a way that something I would pluck from thin air could not. The research is ongoing as I write. I often say that research gives me story and story gives me research. So I'll give you a few examples from my novels. For My Name is Mary Sutter, I went to the National Archives and the Library of Congress, and then later on to the battlefield of Gettysburg. At the National Archives, I asked the librarian to bring me anything to do with Civil War medicine. Out of the back rooms sailed ledgers, boxes, sheafs of invoices from the quartermaster, diaries. They were wrapped in plastic for preservation, and clearly I was the first person to read them in a long time. And as historians, you can imagine how breathtaking that was for me. There were thousands of details, lists of temporary nurses coming in to help after a battle, notes begging for morphine and whiskey and bandages, grocery lists, what to pay the egg man, letters back and forth between physicians about how to treat festering wounds. I used all those discoveries in the novel as the problems that my fictional characters were facing. I set the novel also in one of the hospitals I discovered in one of those boxes. So that particular foray gave me conflict, setting, and what I like to call texture. At the Library of Congress, I read Dorothea Dix's letters and reports. Dorothea Dix, you might remember, as the woman who started nursing in America, modeling herself after Florence Nightingale and her involvement in the war in the Crimea. Now, reading her letters gave me something that I couldn't have gotten from just reading histories of her, in that I began to understand her character, her attitudes, who she was, which helped me set her character arc and her obstacles. So now again, I had conflict and characterization. And as you know, often when you're looking for one thing, you stumble on another. And at the Library of Congress, I found questionnaires from the Sanitation Commission. What was that, you ask? When Lincoln called for men to defend DC at the beginning of the war, Union men poured in from all over the northern United States. There soon ensued a problem, a public health crisis of enormous proportions, because they used the same bodies of water for latrines and for their drinking water. There was a questionnaire form made by inspectors from the newly formed Sanitary Commission, who went from post to post to interview the physicians responsible for each of their set of troops. I used all those questions in the novel in a chapter, but I made up the answers just in order to illuminate the despair of a physician character responsible for those troops in Fort Albany. But from that, I got plot, characterization, obstacle, conflict, all important elements in any novel. And finally, regarding My Name is Mary Sutter, I'll mention Clara Barton's war lecture, which I found in the Library of Congress's American Memory web portal. It seems that generals, people of note from the war, went on a lecture circuit after the war. Who knew? Clara Barton described the aftermath of Second Bull Run, when wounded Union soldiers were amassed at Fairfax Station awaiting evacuation in trains back to DC and the hospitals there. It was utter chaos. And the details that Barton rendered were things I never would have thought of from my vantage point in the 21st century. A particularly scintillating one is that the wounded were lying on hay, and the nurses and volunteers were carrying candles at night, and they were to care for the patients, and they were terribly afraid that they would drop one, ignite the hay, and immolate all of their patients. In addition, another important thing I gleaned from that research was that they instituted triage for one of the first times in the war, which I translated into a climactic decision for one of my characters: plot, texture, characterization, illumination of history. So switching to I Always Loved You, I wrote about Mary Cassatt and Edgar Degas. And here is how an example of research helped me with character. I was having trouble understanding Edgar Degas, his character, his person, his personality. He was very elusive to me. Now, I owned copies of his notebooks, but those were more like a sketchbook, scrap, calendar, notes to self kind of books. Degas went slowly blind from macular degeneration at the end of his life. And I got it in my head that if I just saw a pair of his smoked glasses, I would somehow understand him. And research alerted me that the Musée d'Orsay had his glasses. And not only that, they had artifacts from his studio, which unfortunately were not on display. But I convinced them to show them to me. I went to Paris, and out of a metal filing cabinet, they pulled palettes, paintbrushes, boxes, his pastels, his paint jacket, his hat, and finally those eyeglasses, which didn't quite work the magic I had hoped. And then a surprise, the librarian pulled out a cast for a bust of Degas, a stone bust that was on display upstairs in the d'Orsay. It was clay, and something about the organic nature of that material, the rawness of it, the intimacy of it, gave me the thing I needed to know about Degas. So I translated my moment of discovery, the thrill, the awe, the connection, into a scene in the novel after Degas' death, when Mary Cassatt stumbles on this artifact in his studio. So it is known that at the end of their lives, Degas and Cassatt were not as connected as they had once been. I used this artifact as a way to enliven the regret and conflict they experience. If I hadn't gone to Paris, the novel would be lesser for it. So I got plot and character out of that moment of research. And finally, I'll talk about Winter Sisters. In the book, there's a trial for rape. The rules around prosecution of rape in the 19th century were, as you can imagine, arcane. Women and girls over 10 were considered then to have wanted it unless they fought to the death to prevent it. So living essentially proved that they were complicit. I needed to see what a trial felt like in order to illuminate the insanity of that history. What did the lawyers say? How were victims and witnesses treated? So I drove down a rabbit hole and was able to find several 1882 trial transcripts from New York State where the crime in the novel occurred so that I could present it accurately. Opening statements, questions, judges' interpolations, outcome. I wanted not to make it up. It was too important. From that came illumination of the history and also the illumination that not that much has changed, that bonus thing of illuminating our current state of affairs. You hear those same trial questions today. So to me, there's this wonderful alchemy that occurs between the juxtaposition of the imagination and the real that stems from the research that gives vibrancy to a character and a story. I don't want history to overwhelm story, nor story to obscure history. What I try to do is to weave all that research seamlessly into a compelling work of fiction that illuminates history and also, hopefully, as all novels do, illuminate human nature. So that's me.
Wow, thank you. Again, just wonderful to hear each of you speak so passionately about your subject. And I love how each of you really hammers home the idea of the physical object, of finding that intimacy, and the word you used, Robin, I love the rawness, and then to take that and weave it into your writing. So as I said, we are going to have Robin and Kirby maybe just chat for 10 or 15 minutes together about it. I'm sure each of them has a question or questions for each other. Then we will open it up to everyone for Q&A. And again, if you have questions while they're chatting, please enter them in the chat room and I will shut up. Goodbye.
Bye, David. So Kirby, you live in Seattle. I'm just so terribly sorry we've never met in person.
I know. Can you believe that?
No.
Especially with both of us being history buffs.
Yeah.
I tend to focus on the Northwest, it seems, but yeah. I do have a question for you to start out. Well, first, can I make a statement of admiration? I was able to read Winter Sisters before this conversation, and I mean, so many spots where I was in awe of how you wove the historical details into the conversation, into the narrative. But there's a sentence on page 5 that I had to highlight and copy down for myself. And so if you'll bear with me, I want to read it because I have a specific reason I'm asking for, and I know you'll know what I'm referring to. And this, it's particularly, there's a really bad storm that I think one has already happened and one coming in. And so it's really cold. And I think in Albany, my brain just went blank. Yeah.
Albany, New York. Yeah.
So here's the sentence. But today, Monday, March 10th, was still frozen, and merchants, bankers, printers, engravers, tobacconists, reporters, druggists, lawyers, and one milliner were all converging on State Street to empty mousetraps, sweep refuse from thresholds, and deposit money in empty tills. So I'm totally in awe of how you described, the common work day before, like opening up the shop, the things you would have to do. But you were so clever in the selection of jobs that you mentioned, because they all come to play in the end. And so, or in the big, in the conflict, in the climax. So tell me, please tell me that this was the result of 97 drafts and not just, you did it so easily. I just am I'm just admiring you to select so carefully those those jobs to illustrate what might just seem like someone might say, oh, she's setting up the scene for us, but you're doing so much more there.
Yeah, first of all, that's really sweet. Thank you. And as you probably know, you rewrite your first chapter of your book 100 times. I once heard Ivan Doig speak to an audience, and he read one of his books, and he read his first line, and he said, I rewrote that 100 times. And so, because, as you know, the opening chapter of a book has to do something with the end of the book. You have to do so much, right? You have to signal the ending. You have to set theme. You have to set setting. You have to set place. You have to enliven the world that you're building, because it was, more than 100 years ago, and none of us get to be flies on the wall, though I really want to be. It was opening a city directory to see what were the businesses on State Street at the time. And then that other thing that I'd love to ask you about, which is always a plague sometimes when it comes to editors, but also when you're choosing details for your own book, is what to leave out and what to include. What is vibrant enough to enliven the narrative, but also isn't too distracting. I haven't yet developed a rule for that, although the mantra is always, does it pertain to story? Does it pertain to story? Now, I'm a pretty discursive writer. I like to sort of go around the edges of things to bring the world to life. I'm in current minor battles with my current editor about how much I can keep in. And I'm wondering how you make those choices. And do you get into battles with your editors about that?
I am not in a good position to judge for myself, because I fall so much in love with everything I've learned that I want to put it all in, because it was all essential for me to know, to build the world. I'm sure you feel the same way. In Hattie Big Sky, I swear to God, I had an entire chapter on how to bake bread in a wood stove, because it was essential and fascinating, and also not essential to what she was doing. But yeah. I really needed, like you say, I needed to understand those underpinnings so that I could move her around in her world believably. That you said, so history becomes the character's lived experience. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do. I am very lucky. I have a trusted first reader who cares about me enough to be honest and say, usually she's having to say, this is great, how about a plot? And then the second thing she will say is, do we really need a whole chapter on baking bread? And so because I just get so wrapped up in that first draft. The other thing as you set it aside for a bit, you can come back and see, you can see, oh God, I know I was just trying to shoehorn that in there because I loved it so much. But yeah, we have to look to see if it really is. See, I think I have an extra little layer to be thinking about will this help my younger reader understand this very foreign time and situation? So sometimes I might leave in more things than, I would leave in more things than you would, just so I can give those kids a stepping stone into the book. And I haven't really had too much of an argument with my editors, but my books are not as dense, and they're not adult novels. They are smaller books. So, but I have had like an editor question whether a character belonged, and I realized that I had created that character to buffer my main character from all of her troubles, and like that is not what you want to be doing. So of course that character did not belong. But right? Don't you find just need someone to ask you a question to
and ask a really good question, ask a knowledgeable question, somebody who, like an editor who's a really good reader of fiction, knows that you don't need the name of the person who sold you the yeast for the bread making, right? But you may have spent, like me, 5 hours trying to hunt down who sold yeast in Eastern Montana and how you were able to get it. I mean, it's a never ending source of fascination. I mean, you've probably also had the experience where you spend 5 hours and only to maybe have that imbue half of the sentence, give you a clause. I happen to be of the belief that had I not done those 5 hours of research, I wouldn't have the diction, I wouldn't have the attitude, all those things, for instance, about bread making, imbue the story in a way that isn't tangible, but gives you, say, the way to open an coal and wood burning stove's oven door when you have
buffalo chip burning, I should have said, to be accurate.
Yeah, see, I mean, that is just fascinating stuff you can drop in there that to me speaks to verisimilitude and brings the reader in and gets them to go back in time with you, which is what I always want to do. I always want to go back in time, and part of writing my novels is how can I go back in time and take other people with me.
I do think this isn't quite so much, well, I think it has to do with the topic, but going to the place.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the sense, smells, and like you seeing, you had your heart set that those glasses would be the magic ticket in, but yet you found something else that you wouldn't have found if you had been at home, working from your office research. I mean, it's wonderful that we have so much at our fingertips. I'm so grateful to all the universities and museums that have done that, but going there's nothing like that.
I agree completely. And I have gotten on planes several times to go pick something out. So as you say, there's a lot online now, but there was a particular painting, a very early painting done by Mary Cassatt that was integral to her relationship with Edgar Degas when it first began. And looking at it on screen, I thought, well, that's not bad. I can write around that. And then something told me, I know this is wrong. So I went to the basement of the Philadelphia Art Museum where they had the painting, and seeing it in person utterly changed my impression of it. And I was able to write about it in a way that was far more authentic. And I think I would have died if I'd gone to see it after writing about it and see that I had made such a huge mistake. It would have made me sad to have betrayed Mary Cassatt like that, but also betrayed readers.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, because I did go to Eastern Montana, and I, people didn't buy shoes every year, so they would often go barefoot all summer, everyone. And I had no idea that there are these little tiny cacti that grow intermixed with the prairie grass. So imagine how thick your soles how tough your soles would have to be to walk on that. So, just those, details that, again, that a reader is probably not going to realize we went to all that trouble.
But it
I
gets in the book. It gets in the narrative in a way that maybe even we don't understand.
Yeah, I had a funny story. I really wanted to know what it smelled like to burn buffalo chips.
Sure.
You know, because these clam shacks were usually 9 by 12, so it'd be a close confined quarter. And I mean, of course, there would be a stovepipe going up, but still. And I couldn't find it written about anywhere. So I have a friend who has a cattle ranch in California, in Jamestown, California. And I called her and asked her if she would send me a dried cow patty. And I'm thinking that the one she sent me wasn't quite sufficiently dried, because when it arrived, it was just this, I won't even tell you. It was so horrible. And so I really did have to use my imagination at that point. But we do go, I mean, that's just, I know you've gone to such great lengths too to get that.
I kind of think that one's a little above and beyond.
I wanted to know though. I'm curious, because I know we both do copious research. How do you organize your research?
Well, if you saw my office, it's sort of a representation of my brain, which is not organized. So as I said, I'm sort of an intuitive writer. I was an intuitive nurse. I'm a rather intuitive person. And so I do the research, and it somehow, there's a storage apparatus in my brain. And so when I'm writing, a little bell will go off and I'll remember something that I learned about that. And then I'll go through my notes to find it. I don't outline story. I don't outline my research. It's a very back and forth process for me. How about you? Do you have files? Tell me you don't have files.
Sorry, I do, because I don't have the memory you have, but I use Scrivener. Do you know that word processing program? And so, so you can write in your document, write in your, novel document, and I have all these different files. I mean, I'm like you, it a little bit sticks with me, but I just want, I want the reassurance that I can go back and quickly find that if I need to, what am I getting this right? So
yeah, I don't, I wish I were that organized. I never know what I'm going to need. So I end up with a lot, and I don't have a filing kind of brain.
no,
Yeah.
I don't either. I have boxes, but when I'm done with a project, I have these big, huge bins that has all the research and the books I've gotten to help me get through the book.
May I interrupt?
Sure.
I'm loving this discussion, and I could sit here for a long time listening to you, but I know that we also have several questions. And before I start reading the questions, I just want to, you mentioned Ivan Doig, and one of the stories I've always heard about Ivan was his first novel, Sea Runners, was based on the fact that he came across a tidbit of information in a newspaper. He could never track down any more information. So he decided to write a novel, and he has a PhD in history. But that's what led him down that path, was not being able to find the information, which I think is sort of a nice segue to the question. The first question that's in the Q&A in the chat is, do you change what you plan to write based on your research? For example, when I research, I often get sucked into other areas that I hadn't planned to investigate. Does that change how you write? And it's not addressed to anyone, to either of you.
Kirby, you want to talk?
Go for it, Robin. I'm going to think about that one just for a second.
Yeah. I'm not sure it changes how I write, but I'll tell you a story. Winter Sisters, my third novel, came about because I was writing another novel about a young woman in Paris who goes to the Russian Revolution and gets stuck there. That was my idea. I love Paris. I have a degree in Russian. And while I was doing that, I was thinking about women's rights. And that's when I went down the hole of and discovered about the age of consent, which I didn't know. I stopped writing that other book. That book is underdeveloped, only 3-4 chapters in, and I wrote a whole nother book. So it changes what I write about a lot.
I think I would agree with that. I did not know very much about World War I at all. It was something we never really learned in school. And so when I was writing Hattie Big Sky, I did have an idea of how I thought everything was going to progress. But the more I read, especially about Montana, the more I learned about the anti-German sentiment there and the sedition laws. And I knew I couldn't write that book without incorporating that information in it. Otherwise, I really wouldn't be portraying that time and place accurately. So yeah, I'm not sure it changes how I write, but what gets, maybe what I think the subplots are, or yeah, I hope that answers that person's question.
Great. Second question, if you are using newspapers primarily for world building details instead of factual information, how much documentation, if any, do you keep of that research?
So I agree that newspapers are actually probably secondhand rather than primary resource, because newspapers get things wrong. Editors have a point of view, writers have a point of view. So there is that part that I understand when I'm writing newspapers. I try to cross-reference that against other things if it's really important, and find any other source I can, say, to verify a date, verify what happened. I check other newspapers, other historical newspapers. I read in histories of the time just to try to get a sense of the veracity of the article that I've started to write about.
And I think they're especially useful, though, for getting that sense of prejudice, attitudes,
Yes.
opinions of a time period, as well as language. Wonderful language you can draw from there. So I think it helps me in my vocabulary choice and just understanding what the mindsets of the folks who would have been living at that time period.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Third, how much creative leeway do you allow yourself when your fictional character is interacting with a real historical person?
Well, that conversation never happened, right? So you have to allow yourself a lot of creative leeway. However, for instance, in My Name is Mary Sutter, Lincoln, as well as Dorothea Dix, is a character, and Dorothea Dix and Lincoln got together to discuss nursing. Those are two historical figures. That nobody else was in the room at the White House with them, and I had to imagine their conversation from the historical thing that came out of it and what one person might have said about it entirely. When it comes to fictional characters interacting with historical characters, I use the same leeway, but I never play fast and loose with a historical character's life. I try everything I can to figure out how they lived and what their attitudes were. For instance, Edgar Degas, Mary Cassatt. I didn't play fast and loose with who they were. So that is always in my mind. Who was the historical character? What was their desire? How did they live? How were they involved with the issue? And then I can use my creative leeway to hopefully write an enlivening conversation.
Right, and because they're historical characters, I'm thinking of the Audacity Jones book that you mentioned, David. She helps the magician Harry Houdini, and there is so much material about Harry Houdini that I felt that I could write him believably, even though he never, of course, would have had those conversations with my totally imagined character. So yeah, I agree totally. You have to keep it within the realm of what that person might have actually said or believed, or how they might have acted.
Great. There is a fourth question, and I'm gonna, Trudy, that you posed. And would you say that's pretty similar to what answers your question? Or do you have something you want to change with that from what you wrote? Or
yeah, no, I think they've kind of hit the gist there. I always think about, like, what if there's a real person that you're writing about that you're not crazy about that particular character? Do you portray them as a real character, or can you change personality traits to make the story more interesting, or are you kind of stuck going down that road?
Well, I think that's just a principle of how you choose to be in historical fiction. Like I mean, like I said, there are people who just use history as a jumping off point, personalities as a jumping off point. I just happen to like to stay within the realm. So for instance, Degas was kind of a jerk. There's no question around it. And I let him be a jerk. Much as I love Degas' paintings, I didn't know that about him when I started writing about him. So I felt I had to be true to his character there.
But you know, even jerks might send their mothers a birthday card once in a while. I mean, not, but they're human beings, and so they're not jerks 100% of the time. So you know, it's not like you're having to constantly make him out to be a bad guy. I mean, he has other emotions and elements to him that you can tap into too.
Right, there's nuance in every character, but I do like to stay true to what I know about what historical characters have done and said. But every villain loves his mother.
That's an optimistic view of the world.
They don't know they're villains. They think they're doing the right thing.
Good point. Good point. Kirby, I just have a quick question. So when you, with Hattie, and you wrote a sequel, did you know there would be a sequel?
No, I did not, and I fought against it tooth and nail. I felt like her story was done with the first book. I mean, it wasn't all tied up in a bow, but I felt like I left her in a good place. But readers did not agree with me, and so I never reread my books after they're published, because if I did, I would want to edit them again. And so that was one time when I did reread the book so that I could see if I'd left myself any breadcrumbs to build a second book out of it. And I had, so.
And we basically have a minute or so. What I would love to ask is, what are each of you working on now?
So my next book is coming out in spring. I will just hint to say that it begins in Scotland and it travels through Washington Territory. So that's how David and I got to know a little bit better. David is a genius about Seattle history, Seattle geography, Seattle geology. And so I have been in depth on Seattle history in about the year 1879 to 1882. And more will be coming. More will be forthcoming when they announce.
So you can't tell us the title?
No.
Okay. Is it this spring or next spring?
This next spring.
Okay.
How about you?
I am working on a novel inspired by the first women's transcontinental air race in 1929.
Oh,
That
how cool.
Amelia Earhart came in third. So
That is very cool.
it is very cool. I feel so lucky to be doing this. I don't know about you, Robin, but just to follow my passion.
Yeah, I feel lucky as well.
Well, great. I think Jim is going to come back, but before he does, I just want to say thank you. This has been wonderful and amazing, and in some ways, very much a departure from what we do, but also very much in aligned with what we do of taking history and making it accessible to people. That's what the Guild is all about, and you are choosing to do it in a very evocative and wonderful way. So I thank you both for your conversation, but also for what you do for writing and for history. And I will turn it back over to our fair president, Mr. Roop.
Well, I
Thank you,
must
David.
say, my concern throughout this whole thing is that somehow I would press the mute button and I wouldn't be on mute anymore. And you'd hear me saying, oh my God, that is so cool. And oh my, it's just so impressive. And I laughed and my wife came in. And I said, this is one of the best conversations we've had in the Guild. So many thanks.
Thank you.
And spread the word, everybody. This has been recorded. I think anybody who is interested in writing whether they're interested in writing a novel or just writing in general, they should listen to this. So this has been recorded and it's going to be available on our website. And also you may be inspired to get a hold of Kirby and find out more about liver curry. I'd never heard of such a thing. And I'm also very pleased because I have accredited the 3rd place books, and now I know what I'm going to buy. So thank you very much. I think this was a really excellent presentation. Now, those of you who are listening, you see what good things we do. Keep in mind that memberships need to be renewed, and you'll be getting something, an email or some reminder to tell you to renew your memberships, and then you can, benefit this group that will allow you to hear presentations to find out that Edgar Degas was a jerk. Who knew? Now, our next meeting is April 27th, a Thursday, as always, and the speaker will be Ana Maria Spagna. She's the author of Pushed, Miners, a Merchant, and Maybe a Massacre. And you might ask yourself, what's the maybe all about? Well, she did some research, and this is perhaps a massacre that didn't exist. And she went into some detail, and she will describe her research into the event, including encounters with historians, archaeologists, indigenous elders, migrant workers, and descendants of Gold Mountain sojourners. And, it's a kind of a continuation of what we talked about tonight. It takes a lot of research to find out what the answers are and to create a good book. So with that, I think our meeting is over. Many thanks to Robin and Kirby and for David for putting together this program. And we'll see you next month. Many thanks. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Be well.
Bye. Take care, everyone.